So in addition to categorizing economics by microeconomics and macroeconomics, we can think about a whole bunch of other subfields, of other smaller branches stemming off of microeconomics and macroeconomics. So this tree diagram represents how these different fields of economics are all related to each other. And I should first note that this list is not exhaustive. There are other branches of economics which I'm not including here. So really that's just for spatial limitations. I'm pretty sure you can barely read what this writing indicates as is, and if I would try to fit all the branches of economics, we would run out of space pretty quickly. But secondly, in addition to the micro and macro difference, we can think of maybe a hierarchical or a vertical difference in addition to the horizontal difference. And this is between orthodox and heterodox economics. So orthodox just means mainstream. It means the type of economics that's done at almost every college and university across the country, what's done at most think tanks and companies and corporations. Heterodox just means what is outside of the mainstream of economics. And we are going to be spending most of our time on orthodox, on mainstream economics, because that's going to be maybe more relevant to your careers. It's going to be more closely related to the economics which is done at Kalamazoo College and is done at graduate schools. However, heterodox economics is also really interesting and is perhaps becoming more mainstream, or some fields of heterodox economics are becoming more mainstream. So specifically, we can think about modern monetary theory, which is a field of economics which didn't even have a name like that 12 years ago when I learned it when I was a student in college. But now it is, there are professors in that heterodox branch of economics which are the main economic advisors to politicians such as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So it's interesting to know how something that's outside the mainstream, such as modern monetary theory, which is a branch of post-Keynesian macroeconomic thought, and how that can become mainstream or become more mainstream over a period of time. So in addition to post-Keynesian macroeconomics, we also have Keynesian, which is more mainstream, which is actually probably what defines the economic policy agenda of most developed countries in the world. And obviously these stem from a root word here, which is Keynes, and it's the name of really the founder of modern macroeconomics. And we'll learn a little bit more about Keynes when we study macroeconomics. And these can be contrasted with neoclassical economics, which date back more to relying strictly on the microeconomic foundations of the macroeconomy. And if we take those to their most intense form, then we have Austrian economics. And I include that here because it's important to realize that heterodox economics, being outside the mainstream, can follow different paths along the political spectrum. Post-Keynesian economics, modern monetary theory, is really pretty far left on the political spectrum, as you can tell by my discussion of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. However, Austrian economics, which is free market economics to the extreme, no taxation for any reason, get the government hands off of out of the economy. I shouldn't say for no reason. They believe in public goods to some extent, which we'll discuss later. But that has more support with right-wing politicians like Rand Paul and Ron Paul. So we can see different political ideologies at play here. And in addition to the 4 branches of macroeconomics, I have multiple branches of microeconomics listed here as well. And these different branches of microeconomics deal with applying the economic perspective to particular markets and applications. For example, apply the economic perspective to the environment or to healthcare or to the market for jobs, the labor market, and to business. Behavioral economics, I have as a semi-heterodox branch of microeconomics because it combines the economic perspective with concepts from psychology and starts to relax some of the assumptions about rationality. So I think it's fascinating, and it makes for an interesting combination of perhaps your interest in psychology and how what other forces could be driving our behavior, and combining the economic perspective. So if you have interest in both psychology and economics, that is right up your alley. Originally, this branch was outside of the mainstream, but it's become much more accepted recently. And we'll discuss the difference between environmental and ecological to some extent. Environmental is more mainstream economics as applied to environmental markets, and ecological economics is thinking more about a biological framework for the environment while still dealing with some economic concepts. So with that in mind, this is really, I think, a good roadmap for the different types of economics that we'll discuss in this class. And with that in mind, we'll kind of dive a little bit more into the types of models which are unique to these types of branches of economics. So because that primary difference between the 2 branches of economics that we're going to consider is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, I thought it would be helpful to include a sort of categorization here, a list of how we know whether we're asking a microeconomics question or a macroeconomics question. So a microeconomics question is typically concerned with a single market, is concerned with supply and demand and prices and quantities, quantities just being amounts of what is bought and sold in one specific market, perhaps the market for lumber, thinking about how many fish we should harvest. They're very specific questions. And when we think about macroeconomics, we think about studying not just one particular market, but measures which indicate the health of the society of an entire nation. And these are concerned not with just supply and demand and price and quantities, but with aggregated variables, specifically thinking about unemployment with output or economic growth and with inflation. And that when we think about impacting the outcomes of these markets, we're not going to do so with taxation or placing a price ceiling or a price floor or a quota saying how much we can buy or how much we can produce. We're going to be thinking about impacting the outcomes of these markets through taxation or by increasing the money supply or decreasing the money supply. And so these are really good political economy questions so that we can better understand the decisions which are made by our federal government. And we'll talk about those more actually coincidentally right around the election. So we will discuss those at that point in time. But it's also important to know that in microeconomics, we think more about there being a consensus, not really a consensus, but just less disagreement about the theory of microeconomics, whereas in macroeconomics, due to the failure of economics to be able to predict things like the Great Recession of 2008, there is a little more pluralism, a little more skepticism about what those methods predict. And an example of a microeconomics question would be thinking about a particular market, thinking about how we can increase the tax on gasoline to impact the sale of cars. And so we're thinking about particular markets, and we're thinking about outcomes which are related to price and to quantities. Whereas when we think about a macroeconomic question, we're thinking about those aggregated measures. So for example, how would decreasing the top marginal tax rate impact growth of GDP? And so these, I think, are good examples of how we can differentiate what defines a micro question from a macro question. So as promised at the beginning of this video, this is the list, as exhaustive and extensive as I can create it at this point in time, of the types of models which we will be learning in this class. So we're going to learn two primary microeconomics models. Those are going to be the model of comparative advantage and the supply and demand model. Now, within the supply and demand model, we're going to add some bells and whistles so that we can better describe the reality and the nuances of reality by considering elasticity and how supply and demand operates in monopolies and how externalities and taxation impact supply and demand. And these are going to sound like new vocabulary words to you at this point, most likely. However, we will discuss those before the first exam in the next couple weeks. When we move on to macroeconomics after the first exam, we're going to be thinking about the model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So adding up the supply and demand of all individuals, of all agents in the economy for a nation. And we're going to then think about different ways which we can impact those aggregate outcomes of unemployment, inflation, and growth by considering a model of fiscal policy using the expenditure output model or the Keynesian cross model. And we're also going to think about how we can impact those aggregate variables by using monetary policy, which is going to involve a model of the money multiplier and a model of the basic equation of money. And so I think this is a good roadmap for thinking about the next 9 weeks. And with that in mind, we will return to macroeconomics specifically after the first exam, but in the next set of videos, we're going to dive into our first model of this class, which is that of comparative advantage. So we're going to be looking at some building blocks of that model first, but by the end of that set of videos, we will be ready to see how we can use a model to make predictions about policy and make predictions about the behavior of agents in the real world.